also going to happen in your region. They're going to be folks that you can chat with. Otherwise, don't hesitate to send me email and things if you need to. I'm happy to chat with anyone, regardless of where you are in the state, if you needed this as well. So let me do a little bit here to go. So let me present a problem to you. All right. So this is was a part of a master's thesis, but this is a problem that Brian gave to his high school students. So I'll have you take a look at this. So again, in a spirit of what Brian and Kathy talked about earlier this week about problem-based learning, trying to give the students an ill-structured problem. Now, we're not going to spend time critiquing whether this is a good one or not, but we're just going to use it right now as an example as we go. And also, obviously, he's giving them a chance to say something mathematically to reach some kind of a qualitative, quantitative way of saying who's the best player. And again, it's ill-structured because we haven't given the students a way necessarily, like what do they need to know and all those kinds of things that they walked us through that you would do with your students to develop the problem. So here's this problem that Brian had. And actually, Brian had, because he was doing this thesis, he actually had 3 research questions that he was interested in exploring. And we're not asking you to have multitude type questions for your project, but I just thought I would present these because he was looking at a range of layers. So obviously he was looking at himself in that first question. What's it mean? Because some of you may never have taught a problem-based learning experience. You might have experience in project-based learning, and there's some similarities with those two as well. And so he wanted to say, how does it affect me? And so he actually kept a journal of his frustrations and successes and looked at those. Obviously, he wondered, what about my kids? The attitude. Brian visited a little bit about attitude when we move into changing the classroom contract, which is all unspoken, but kids expect to sit and be delivered to. And they expect you to give them all that they think they need and to come back to what we were saying earlier, just plug in the right numbers and get it right. So we sort of have this unspoken contract. And so when we do problem-based, and I don't know if the fellow on Tuesday for Flipped also talked about the attitudinal shift for the students to also, sometimes they're upset and they're angry because you're doing nothing and they're doing everything. And they have no concept of behind the scenes. So they don't know how much you planned, the materials you did. They don't know a thing. They just know that in this environment, something switched. So he also wanted to know what was the attitudes here. And then obviously he has a learning question as well. What he's really interested in is, do they improve in their problem-solving abilities? All right? So I'm hoping that you will also take a look at some learning, have a learning question as your driving question for your action research project. And because of our time frame, I'm saying action research, but we're going to, again, like we did last year, call this an impact project because we only get a very short period of time and we can't really do multitude cycles that action research invites us to think about. So I want you to think about, as you're starting to percolate, what you might want to do with your students and think about how you want to know if they've learned some concepts better. Just kind of begin to think about this, and we have to put in the fact that you're going to be doing this in September when school starts, or late August for some of you, all right? We have a cycle for action research, impact. So obviously, hopefully we're percolating somewhat of a focus today, and then you're going to be doing some kind of teaching, you're going to collect some kind of data, you're going to look at that data, you're going to think about that data, you're going to report back to us, okay? And then you might actually, the way the cycle's supposed to work is, obviously you learn something that you want to make changes, and again, the cycle of action research can just be continuous and change. So, the focus for Brian was on problem solving, how problem-based learning affected student learning. All right, so ultimately, because we're trying to maybe press to invite you to think about using a problem-based approach, kind of think about how does that experience of problem-based learning and the students being more actively involved in ways that you might not currently engage in, and I don't mean to imply that you don't, because I know in listening to some of you over the last couple of days, I know you're trying to find many, many ways to have your students engaged in what they're doing. So, he, again, wants to know whether or not his using that problem of the basketball players is going to help them improve their problem-solving ability. All right. So now he has to be after developing some kind of, and you're going to be invited to develop some kind of a question. Right? So these are just 3 possible questions. Usually they might start with how or what are good starters for this, and we'll talk about this in a moment. But these are just 3 possible kinds of things, with Brian's being, again, the last one that's here. So one of our tasks today is to begin thinking about a question that you may want to ask. This is time frame I just want you to be aware of in terms of dates. You're going to have whatever the date your school starts, and Jan and Ellen are going to be pressing you with emails to say, hey, colloquium's going to come up. We're going to be presenting to each other from across the state, and we do that all virtually. We get together in our regions and everything, and then hear and what's going on. But they want to have your projects up at Coal Hub by September 21st. And later I'll have Ellen and Jan talk about the PowerPoint slides, how many, it's not many, to represent your project. And those need to come before the colloquium so that we can get them distributed out, and so that each region has a set. So as you're talking, especially if you're a virtual voice, we have slides advancing in our locale so we can follow along with what you're telling us as well. Also, you need a little bit of time between the pre-test, post-test to get some kind of indication of, did my students learn? So there's an implication there'll be pre-test, post-test. And that make sure you have time for your analysis. And so this is going to be rough. And I don't know, did any of you folks, when you talked about your project, talked about when you actually really, how close to the first day of school you actually really started your impact study? Because I know it varies.
Day 2.
Day 2. Okay, so day 2.
Here's your pre-test.
So Tracy, you're right. So Tracy did pre-test day 2. And actually, even if you're not quite getting to where you want mathematically in the first week, the pre-test can occur, because obviously it's supposed to be before you teach anyway. So it could have a little bit of time in that, right. All right, as well. But again, just kind of map out on your schedule what seems to make sense for you as well. Think about, because one of the things Brian and Kathy tried to talk about on Monday for problem-based learning was you may already have existing units. And this is tough because we have to, sadly the state makes us close at the end of September, so we don't have a lot of time to say what should come first. And there's certain things in your teaching you know have to come first in your course, and it just has to be there. But again, think about it, and then how might it be structured in the spirit of problem-based learning, right? So that's going to be some of our thinking and hopefully conversations together to talk about those kinds of things. Again, you're going to be crafting some things out. I think Brian and Kathy were clear that you have some thinking work to do in terms of making sure you think about what the problem is and how it fits your existing curriculum and meeting the standards and everything else that's going on. So we also want to kind of think about this. And then I have no way of knowing how this changes what you do. Only you'll be able to bring, once you know what your problem is that you're going to be creating and how your students are going to actually work in that problem, will you know this impact on how much it has to modify what you're doing or not. Once you know, you'll develop your pretest, and your pretest will be your post-test. So it's okay on the pretest. You should have the range. So if you have a 2-week unit that you normally do, whatever normally happens, in the mathematical understanding development should be all represented on the pretest, because we would assume the students couldn't. And if all your students get 100%, they don't need the unit. You might as well move on to something else. Well, that's what they say. I mean, why are we doing it if they don't need it? So we just move on. Now we know that probably is not going to happen. The rare kid, but your pretest and your post-test will be the same document. So for example, this is a sample of a partial pretest on problem solving. Okay, so students have to work on some of these different options, different representations. And Brian used a rubric. Was the answer correct or not correct on the previous pretest, but he was looking at problem, in this case, problem solving criteria. And so if we come down that first column, there's 5 things that he's looking for, right? Understood the problem, information, procedures, representation, could answer the problem. And so they're looking at this again. And so having a rubric like this may be new to you for some things. So you might actually go and think about this as a possibility. Also, you may have a certain kind of problem where maybe you're looking at the procedure, you know what the procedural things are that students are supposed to attack in the problem, but you have a way of gathering information about that. So you have whatever you say is your pretest score, and using those same teacher thinking things for your post-test as your post-test, all right? But if he was using a rubric, then somewhere, most of you have electronic grade books. If you do not, this is just a simple Excel sheet where we put in the pretest, the post-test, and computed a gain score on the students for their efforts. So we'll be asking you to also report your students' improvements as well. And so often a typical representation is just a simple graph that graphs out the pretest to the post-test results. Then we're going to ask you to reflect on the experience and to write up the reflection. Now this won't be in your proposal, this will be in the final things due. So in a moment we'll separate what you need to submit later this month, except for Dominican folks, that's in July, and then what needs to be submitted in September. But again, we're going to ask you to think through this, to not only to speak to us, but also inform, more importantly, inform you and your teaching. Questions at this point before we move in, Tracy?